was a great start. Thank you very much, Gayatri and Jitesh and Ivan. Yeah, I think I have a loud carrying voice. Is this audible?
Yeah, we are recording.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Patrick Flores. Patrick is the professor of art studies at the Department of Art Studies at the University of the Philippines, where of which he has been the chair from 1997 to 2003. He's the curator of the Vargas Museum in Manila. He was one of the curators of Under Construction, New Dimensions in Asian Art in 2000, and the Gwangju Biennial, which was curated by Okui and Visor in 2008. And I met Patrick first during Under Construction when Ranjit and Patrick, amongst others, were curators of this show, which dealt with an expanded idea of Asia. And then I again met him during the preparations of the Gwangju Biennial, and he curated one of the position papers. And he'd called his exhibition Turns in Tropics. And what was really interesting about his show was that the participants, the contributors to the show were people who had been artists in the first place, but then their career in a way hyphenated between being an artist and a curator and historian. So therefore the subtitle of the show was Turns in Tropics, Artist-Curator. So we're talking about people like Jim Sapankat, Apinan Koshananda, Albano, Piyadasa, who began as artists, avant-garde artists, and then dedicated themselves to art history and curation. And I was absolutely fascinated by that exhibition. I remember we had long conversations when you were putting it up. And I think we'll perhaps talk a little bit about it even during the discussion. And I'm not going to take more time, just to also add one more thing, which is that he has curated the Philippine Pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 2015, and he's been appointed the artistic director of the Singapore Biennial 2019. A warm welcome to you.
So, thank you, Nancy, for the introduction, and thank you, Geeta, Vivan, and the entire foundation for the invitation and the hospitality and the friendship. I'm delighted to be in Delhi. I have some slides, so can we switch off the, okay. I begin by saying that this reflection is a partial account of installation that comes from a particular place and time in the Philippines. This gesture towards partiality and particularity is expected in a kind of art history that is sensitive to the contingencies of method, ecology, and material. This being said, the same gesture, rather than merely rehearsing the rituals of context setting, actually performs the delicate politics of representation and presence, which can only be partial and particular, and so needs to be supplemented or redistributed because it lacks the vaster atmosphere of possible relations elsewhere. These relations may in fact release the partial and the particular from the specificity of site and instance into an extensive event like the installation that is in many ways ethnographic, archival, activist, transversal, allegorical, and immersive. In this regard, it might be worth revisiting the work of Gaston Bachelard on the idea of the problematic, or the persistent anxiety that stirs up inquiry and anticipates response to this anxiety. The installation problematic is the very technique that renders the installative as a thought process or a work of thinking through what this symposium calls the spatial construct. For Bachelard, the problematic expresses doubt about the world, but in the same vein, enables this dubiousness or indeterminacy to be dialectically and discursively confirmed. The object therefore becomes interesting, or better to say instructive, because it seeks to perform its agency in the universe, specifically in an intersubjective condition like the installation, as it lays bare its formative nature and subjects itself to experience, which in the French language is likewise to experiment. It should be noted that Bachelard, author of Poetics of Space and Psychoanalysis of Fire, is very similarly an attentive observer of space and its poetics, categories that lie at the heart of the installative. As a form of poetics, space for him is, and I quote him, lived not in its positivity, but with all the partiality of the imagination. The partiality of imagination may pertain to both incompleteness and inclination, which may also characterize the contingency of space and the constructedness of spatiality. Furthermore, Bachelard dismantles the outside and inside binary and considers the relationship of the two at once uneven and porous, as he asks, and I quote him, "What overflow of a ramified interior does the outside call?" At this point, I identified the works of Philippine artists Raymundo Alban and Ileana Lee. They serve as indices of the partial and the particular, and surely of the Philippine. They become trajectories into the installative rather than exemplifications of the normative terminology that is the installation. I am foregrounding works that are minimal, exposed, and unexpected, with the view to grasping how the installative plays out a space of sympathy and appearance and opens itself up to the remediation of whatever interest is poised to fill out its calibrated autonomy, be it image, object, body, sound, data, text, and all potentially animate things or species. Raymundo Alban was a figure of very copious interests. He was an artist, a curator, a poet, a thinker, and a writer. I focus on one text and one work. In 1974, he submitted to the 9th International Biennial Exhibition of Prints in Tokyo an instruction to spread sand over an area and let people step on it, and called his entry in a print biennial, "Step on the Sand and Make Footprints." And actually it was awarded a prize. He regarded it as a work of print because it fundamentally consists of a mark realized by the pressure of an entity like the body, which may be mediated by footwear and transferred onto a ground, which is sand in all its granularity and ordinariness. I am intrigued by the work because of the ambiguity attending its nomination as print, its site specificity, its hyper-flexibility, its openness, and finally, its hospitality. Here, the reprographic is simultaneously installative, in which the multiplicity or replication of the democratic print translates into an assembly of bodies that walks or perambulates, performs and reiterates decisive steps destined for erasure. As has been mentioned, Albano was a curator too, who designed the posters of the exhibitions he curated, and so bringing once again the installative and reprographic forms into a generative situation of the curatorial and the museological, of the informative and the pedagogical within the context of design. The second work from Albano is a text. In his 1981 essay, Installations, A Case for Hangings, he conceives of installation as, in his words, a childhood urge. It forms part of the habits of climbing trees, raising arches, scaling towers to ring bells, burning effigy on Easter Sunday, making and hanging lanterns for Christmas, and so on. At the same time, it is a term transacted through the vocabulary of the Western modern, albeit enlivened in local history, or what Pierre Nora calls lieu de mémoire, or realm of memory. In the context of developmental, in which it was implicated, and we can see the other essay that he wrote on your right, the installative aesthetic was furthermore an unfolding experiment. It testified to an environment outside of the museum that was being primed by the post-independence Southeast Asian nation state like the Philippines to become democratic and developing, aspiring to its rightful place in the international economic and political order. This same state was also in the process of becoming authoritarian, as it invested in accelerated infrastructure, export of goods and human labor, social amelioration, counterinsurgency, and counter-oligarchy, and national identity. In this agenda, to be bodily and culturally original in the post-colony was a fraught but ultimately necessary posture. As Albano looked back at the installations in the Philippines since 1968, and I quote him, "It may be that our innate sense of space is not a static perception of flatness, but an experience of mobility, performance, body participation, physical relation at its most cohesive form." End of quote. For Albano, this would characterize, as it were, the installative Kunstwollen as distinctly Philippine because it is, to quote him, akin to fiestas and folk rituals from all our ethnic groups. In other words, installation was for Albano deemed intrinsic and embodied by way of orality, folklore, and everyday life. At this intersection, the installative might be viewed as partly a vector of the local that would mediate or even metabolize the international discourse of the installation. With the practice of Albano as a cipher, certain theoretical entry points open up into the domain of installation. Albano initially suggests how the internal transformations within the form of sculpture extended into something else. He would describe it as new sculpture because it resists being fixed, either as monument or object, on a base as prescribed by custom. Indeed, it assumes the tendency of the material, spreading, hanging, stretching, laying down arbitrarily. Such emancipation from the base is made possible by a range of methods, which Albano marks as foundational. He draws signals from the work of the Philippine artist Junier, who in Wood Things would conjure a total visual installation, according to Albano, in the form of dry leaves attached to the floor, dry branches hang from the ceiling and float in mid-air, colored lights heighten strange illumination of the work, shadows spread patterns throughout the room. End of quote. Albano rounds out this analysis with a confident inference, and I quote him, "The fact that a sculptor no longer depends on gravity alone changes attitudes towards the concept of art itself." It is from this assertion that Albano unsettles the ways by which art is captured in art historical taxonomies. And he further asks, what is permanently in art? The object? What is sculpture? Or can sculpture borrow from theater, landscape, architecture, and science? This theory on installation would thicken Albano's notion of the regional or the local, and by extension of the international or the Western, in which he daringly speaks of, and I quote, local contemporary art. In explaining the sources of this local contemporary art, he explains, and I quote, "We should also see them in international art. We may be able to make a claim, and what a more meaningful experience would it be if part of our preserving our tradition is the recognition that its scope of presence is worldwide." End of quote. The international and the local therefore become co-present through and co-producer of the installative. I take interest in this set of works of Albano to make a point about the installative propositions, in the installative proposition in terms of its art historical remediation in Southeast Asia. Geeta Kapur has already sharply annotated the art history of the installative in relation to the work of Vivan Sundaram. Inspired by that response, I wish to propose the following entry points into the installative project, entry points that are in turn supplemented by the discursive and curatorial work by a person like Raymundo Alban. First is the technology of the print that is unhinged as a term and turns installative. In conversation with Albano's work in terms of repetition and inclusivity is Ileana Lee's participation at the first Fukuoka Asian Arts Show in 1980. The work of Ileana is this masking tape work that moves around the gallery. I think you can see it, no? In this event, Lee delicately cut tape to form lines and fixed them on the wall and ceiling to delineate space within space, a reprise of an earlier work. This might have been the first work of installation in the history of the Fukuoka exhibitions, in which the specificity of site, medium, and technique responded to the problematics of contemporary art, on the one hand, and to the exigencies of local participation in an international event on the other. Furthermore, that Ileana Lee, was a woman in a male-dominated art world in Japan, and most of Asia was germinal. For a woman artist to plot out a parasitic space in a museum and embody her wandering presence without the artifice of the object of art was not merely an exploit. It ordained an all-over atmosphere. In this instance, the installative becomes a schema to be inhabited, a space within a space, some kind of a feminist misang abim. The second entry point is new sculpture. And in this regard, I go back to the cultural center of the Philippines that Imelda Marcos, the First Lady of Ferdinand Marcos, built by first reclaiming land from water. This is Imelda on you, I think you know, in what might be Emilio Pucci dress. It may well be that the sculptural transfigures into the monument that is the architecture behind her. The architect of the building, Leandro Locsin, likens the edifice to a buoyant sculpture. And if we are sufficiently ludic, we could even cast Imelda as sculptural. As herself sculptural, an omnipresent sculpture of patronage in an expanded field with Rosalind Krauss, via Rosalind Krauss, who at once delineates and encompasses landscape and artifice, site and object. Such ethos of monumentalization of an authoritarian government that wished to assert its presence in the Cold War in Southeast Asia was resisted aesthetically through social action and counter-sculpture. And here I move towards the end of the talk with David Medallion, who protested at the opening of Imelda Center and earlier had worked on kinetic sculptures called the bubble machines or cloud canyons, which were partly inspired by the clouds over Manila Bay, the view of which was disrupted by the brutalist monument of the Cultural Center. According to Guy Brett, Medallia's project brought together matter and energy. It was a something and a nothing at the same time, a continuous repertoire of biomorphic forms which passed away as soon as they came into being. Medallion also wrote a manifesto titled which begins with, and I quote him, "I dream of the day when I shall create sculptures that breathe, perspire, cough, laugh, yawn, smirk, wink, pant, dance, walk, crawl, and move among people as shadows move among people. Sculptures that will retain a shadow's secret dimensions without a shadow's obsequious behavior. Sculptures without hope, with waking and sleeping hours." Medallion finally initiated the exceptionally generous London Biennale in 2000, a biennale, in his words, that would be open to every artist regardless of age, sex, ethnic origin, and artistic language or style. For the critic Brett, in this biennale, Medallion would replace the bureaucracy of selection with the poetics of participation across multiple sites all over the world. with Medallion as some kind of an excitation, and a possible trajectory of a Biennale in the making through counter sculpture, we can begin to reflect on how the artist assembly Ruang Rupa, based in Jakarta, might direct the next documenta within an installative international problematic as it mingles with the convivial and the urgent. Formed in the year 2000, Ruang Rupa initiates cross-disciplinary events to produce collaborative work in the form of art projects such as exhibitions, festivals, art laboratories, workshops, researches, as well as books, magazines, and an online journal publication. Recently, Ruang Rupa co-developed a cultural platform, Gudang Sarina Ecosystem, together with several artist collectives in Jakarta. It is a cross-disciplinary space that aims to cultivate an integrated system for communities, practitioners, and institutions, resulting in exhibitions, festivals, workshops, discussions, film screenings, music concerts, and publications of journals. Just last year, Ruang Rupa co-initiated Good School, Contemporary Art Collective and Ecosystem Studies, a public learning space established to practice an expanded understanding of collective values such as equality, sharing, solidarity, friendship, togetherness, hanging out, and festival making. Central in the proposition of Ruang Rupa is the formative collective, a cognate of the Installative International, in which various ethnicities and energies across life worlds find common ground. A chance of meeting or a chance meeting, like the one that happens on Raymundo Albano's shifting, ever redistributive sand, or is surrounded by Ileana Lee's space within space. Such an encounter might constitute what Albano calls the roots, basics, beginnings of an opportunity for an, in his words, an ecumenical situation, even if this took place within or because of a cultural center of an authoritarian nation state that curtailed the rights of the body. Albano, in fact, referred to a world suddenly turning visible through the procedures of new art, a phrase that is uncannily reminiscent of Foucault's phrase, sudden vicinity of things. One might want to recall an earlier time in Southeast Asia in the 90s when the Chiang Mai social installation in northern Thailand materialized the potential of the spatial construct of installation, in which city and citizens remapped and re-inhabited each other socially and installatively. It is this porosity and ambiguity of forms that may delay the recognition of art. And in that interval of alternation between art and life, generate a possibility of an intuition for the social and hopefully supplement or redistribute the intelligence of the contemporary. Thank you.
That was marvelous, Patrick. A thoroughly enjoyable presentation. It's interesting because also our presentations overlapped. I was talking about contextualizing the particular, and you're talking about contextualizing both the partial and the particular. You are also signaling towards that which is provisional in installationary art practice. But what I found really intriguing about your presentation was how you talk about the space of porosity and opacity. Opacity, porosity between art and life. And how, again, you exemplified that notion through what you call the childhood urge of Albano, talking about how the installation art practice could also be seen, a kind of prehistory of the installation art practice could be seen in the form of the effigies, the public festivals. So you're moving into the area of popular culture versus the museal culture, which then gets codified through what you have called a normative terminology of installation art, versus what we are talking about, which is that which is provisional or partial. And again, I mean, as far as porosity goes, you talk about the Chiang Mai social installation. You also talked about Rongrupa. But one of the most interesting aspects of your installationary presentation was how you bring in, this canonical text of sculpture in the expanded field and use Krauss's diagram to, in a way, mark Imelda Marcos's, one would say her regime, and how she actually uses in a way, the very infrastructure of installation to spread and distribute her cultural patronage.
Correct. Yeah.
And for me, that I thought was extremely interesting, because I think earlier you spoke about the distributive aspect of installation art, which again can also, mean the collaborative notion, various kinds of actors from different economies coming together, different classes, etc. But here we're not just talking about a field of social relations, because what Patrick has brought in is actually the state actor herself as, in a way, producing an installation of patronage, of infrastructure. And then you brought in artists who then make a counter-sculptural move. And I found that really fascinating. Just to respond to also briefly, before Geeta tells me to wrap up, to what you were saying in terms of Albano talking about public festivals and effigies as a prehistory of installation art. Hakubai passed away recently. And again, when I used to have conversations with Hakubai and Dashrath Patel, they would often tell me, and this was, I think, when I was in my 20s and I was writing for the Times of India, and when I'd be doing features, they'd often say, yeah, but everybody's talking about installation art now. But installation art exists in the streets. If you just go to a vegetable market, the kind of infrastructure that is produced by, the fruit seller, for instance, or the vegetable seller, that also could be seen as a form of installation art. But of course, the point is that what happens when you actually make installation art as a conscious gesture?
Yeah.
That's where the difference lies. That doesn't mean that the fruit seller or the vegetable seller is not showing her or his agency. Of course, there is an agential imagination at work, which brings the aesthetic and the political together, or the aesthetic and the functional together. But how do you see this slippage or this transition, please?
Yeah, I think on face value, we may be tempted to see Albano trying to romanticize a pre-art world instantiation of form, in like a childhood urge or a festival form. But I think that's when you read Albano, it's a partial account of installative, the history of installation, because on the other hand, he also responds to art world conversations that he was also part. He was aware that he was part of that conversation. He was curator of contemporary art at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and he curated exhibitions, local exhibitions as well as international exhibitions. So he was also a part of that conversation of international art. But what is interesting in Albano is he doesn't look at the instantiation within the locality as like some kind of provincial exemplification of the form. Actually, he reverses the argument by saying that actually, if it's international, if we want to call it installation and it's part of the international vocabulary, it's actually local. It's actually local, and that, but this doesn't isolate the local from that discourse, because in fact the local co-produces that discourse. So I think that is what is productive about Albano's work as an artist and as a curator, and also as an annotator of form, as he produced it. So I think it's an exceptional talent to coordinate all these things, the discursive, the curatorial, the artistic,
pedagogical,
and also the administrative, because he ran a museum, and the boss was Mrs. Marcos. And so on the other hand, he also had to mediate the interests of the First Lady as someone who invested greatly in a folk, almost nativist art on the one hand, but on the other, international art during the Cold War. So I think that's how I would respond to that question. To that question. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just one more question before we open the discussion up. But what I also found very interesting was when you talked about the reprographic. This was in the context of the print biennial and Albano's work in that. And I was just thinking, we've constantly been talking, even Vivan was talking about it, Geeta was talking about repetition, erasure. So when you're talking about printmaking, when you're talking about the printmaking form, you're speaking about repetition, additionality.
Correct, yeah.
And when something is actually unmoored or unhinged from its objecthood and turned into a mise en scène, a scenography, then what happens? I mean, would you like to elaborate on the installative, aspect in this case?
Well, yeah. This work for me is interesting because Albano was able to. Well, it was a competition. He was working within rules, but he was self-consciously transgressed or tried to push the limits of the definition of print by submitting not actually a print but an instruction. So I think the first instance of the transgression was just submitting an instruction. No? And second was this sand thing, no? Spread across for people to step on. So that I think is a fundamental moment of the installative. No? First is to it introduces a problematic, meaning some kind of epistemic break. No? It is, I think this is also the afterlife of Bachelard's notion of the problematic that was picked up by Foucault's problematization. No? The work introduces a problematic, and that's an installative problematic, as well as a print problematic, no, by extension, because the idea of the print would be so unsettled. No? And secondly, it's a fundamental, I think, moment in installation because it created a certain condition for people to. I think Geeta was talking about walking through, right? That the installation is. Consists of that moment of walking through. So this is, literally an act of an invitation for people to walk, but on the sand. But there was, I think, also this moment of decisiveness because you have to make a footprint. You just, so that decisiveness is my entry point into this this ethical urgency that. The installative invites that you have to make certain decisions when you respond to the installation to make a mark of your presence and also your intellectual labor or political investment, whatever. Yeah, in that situation. Yeah. So,
what you leave behind, the residual consciousness that you leave behind.
Correct.
Which cannot be again calibrated or reined in. It's something that happens and then disappears.
Correct. Yeah, and with other people.
Yes.
So there is a high level of contingency or openness in this situation that I think lies at the heart of the installative.
Yes. Please. Maybe you need the mic. Yeah.
So it seems like whether it was Albano or other artists that you mentioned, treating the sand piece as a printmaking situation, and we all see installations that seem like sculptures often, and things like that. So can the medium, for the lack of a better term, be actually defined by? It could be, for instance, the printmaking piece could also be a performance thing. It could be, or an instruction piece, like some of those wall drawings. By Saul Lewitt, exactly, or
Yoko Ono.
Or Yoko Ono, any of these things. So is it sort of a catch-all term that we're using for works of art that sort of fall between the cracks for a lot of these other mediums. Or is that the definition of the form, which is that it is a form that kind of combines all of these different things and is again like a catch-all term sort of for things that fall through. I'm curious what both of you have to say about that.
Well, I think the most productive thing to do as an attitude towards terms is to look at it deconstructively, just to put it under erasure all the time, to go through it, but with a certain possibility that you transgress it at some point. No? So these are like heuristic terms. No? I mean, they are. Yeah, if you have that deconstructive attitude towards terms, then you're not wedded to the doctrine that sustains it, but in a way fulfills the promise of the condition that produced the term, meaning contemporary art or whatever. No? So, but it has to settle at some point, and yeah, but it doesn't mean that you cannot unhinge it from that fixation, through practice and discourse, and also neologism. Produce another term.
Yes. Yeah.
Just what?
Okay, so producing another term, is that sort of the solution as you see it? You mentioned neologism, but like could be, or is it that it's okay to have like an ambiguous term, because it has been ambiguous for a long time, right?
Yeah, and maybe move away from the noun. That's why I call it installative rather than installation, because the installation is a bit, it settles. There's like sedimentation.
I'd agree with Patrick, and that's why I talk about the installationary attitude, which became kind of fulcrum of my presentation. So yes, this heavy lumbering noun installation actually tells you very little. And as you correctly pointed out, it is a catch-all term. I would say it's an umbrella term, which is hospitable to many slippages and transgressions. And perhaps, I like the fact that it's fluid, provisional, partial, particular. And that's what allows for this genre to be open-ended, to be a sieve at times, to be an epistemic break at others,
But partial also means positioned, because it's the term is both partial, meaning incomplete, but also positioned. You're not impartial. No?
Yeah, exactly. It's a positionality.
It's a positionality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just in continuation with this, that when the audience steps into the installation, right? I mean, it is not an ordinary step. It is kind of an extraordinary step, right? Because see that most of the times it is the audience, it is the other, it is the body of the audience which changes it. When we talk about new esteems, or when we talk about attitudinal things, or when we talk about the definitional deficits, and I just feel it, because when we step into the installation, somehow there is this possibility of ritual making. When it actually makes us to act without any guidance nor kind of direction for the audience. But in the case of the sand walking, it definitely the audience carries some sort of impression within their feet, the pressure. What we can show through the image is another thing. So there is this another possibility of joining with the performativity of the audience, which hinges on to the idea of installation. So definitely we're all struggling to how to link up with this second step. I just it reminds me of Ghalib couplet, hai kaha tamanna ka dusra qadam yarab. So what is the second step of the desire to enter, through the porosity of the categories? That is basically a wonderful moment for all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautifully put. Yeah.
I just had a small little, note I mean, as we are at this noun-verb binary, it just kind of reminded me of Geeta's initial remark of installation actually being a verb becoming a noun. And in Albano's case, it seems rather interesting because every other artist delivered a noun, delivered a print, whereas he actually delivered a verb, the actual act of printing. So I just thought I had that line.
Also an imperative.
Yes.
To step, an imperative. I mean, in the imperative mood, to step on the sand. I mean,
Yeah.
Submit a verb in a way.
Yeah, maybe that's the future, no?
You mentioned Imelda Marcos's hospitality to international art.
Yeah.
What happened to it? What did she collect? How was it shared? What is the residue? And does it command a continuity in terms of museum collection? Is it seen as an isolated aberration? And how is it viewed culturally? Is it a mark of a regime, or is it a part of a Filipino art history?
Yeah, well, yeah, tough question. But yeah, there was Imelda supported international art. In fact, the architecture itself is internationalist in the brutalist mode. So that was part of it. Although that was an abstraction of the native house. The cultural center is an abstraction of the native house. So in the international language was also hospitable to that kind of locality. And in recent studies on brutalism, in fact, say that brutalism was a very hospitable type of architecture, though it's not so apparent. But I mean, in terms of the practice of people dwelling in it or making all sorts of things within it is like a hospitable form. So this was also the Cold War, and the Marcos regime played the Cold War card well by supporting the Americans by hosting the American bases in the Philippines, but also welcoming socialist culture into the center. That's why you see some, I think, examples of Brancusi, an exhibition of Brancusi and Romanian painting in the center. So it's been conflated with the dictatorship. So people tend to look at it. It's of course it's been stigmatized as as fully instrumentalized by the authoritarian nation state. But I think that's not a very productive way to look at what happened at the cultural center. But that requires some form of elaboration in another symposium, I guess. But the conflation is there, and they suffer from the stigma of public opinion, although they are still in power. The Marcos family is in power, and currently one of the daughters of Ferdinand is running for the parliament, and Mrs. Marcos for a long time was a member of parliament, even after the revolution that deposed the regime. Yeah.
I'd just like to add to something that Gayatri was asking you. On the one hand, Marcos produced this cultural infrastructure, acquired objects for the museum, the State Museum. But what I would also like to ask you is, not just at an infrastructural level, the fact that the Marcos regime also gave what one would call genius grants, right? So I'm also very interested in the fact that, perhaps it's easier to understand, how you can stigmatize that, a collection which comes out of a dictatorship. But what happens to this liminal position of a person who has been awarded or a genius grant by the state? Can you give some examples of what happened to those people, if they were artists or scientists? And are there some people who have become famous who were given those genius grants? And how did state patronage affect them at an individual level? Sir? Yeah, I know, but it's sorry. I know we've gone beyond but I just felt maybe there is an installation artist who actually was given a genius grant, and
I think they are able to. Well, the part of it is the link to the Marcoses, but they are seen also as talents of their own, and I think transcended that Marcos association. But Marcos, Imelda created this National Artist Awards, and in fact, she in a very pioneering way established a Philippine High School for the Arts, like a particular high school that the curriculum was really just centered on art.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Patrick. And in this kind of very rich configuration, there's kind of, you of course evoke Imelda Marcos, and she is of course, somebody whose shadow kind of spans across this configuration. So there's of course power, there's violence, but in placing childhood in somewhere in the middle of this configuration, there is the question of memory that becomes re-energized and almost reappears. So this memory is, of course, political memory, but it's also the memory of the body as the prints on the sand. Or it's also the memory of objects. I was actually thinking, maybe as a proposition, that perhaps in what you suggest, the opening, the very exciting opening that I feel that I can glimpse is that in the installative, as you call it, an act, or as a can erasure actually militate against amnesia? Because in commonsensical political mobilization, we think of erasure as an ally of amnesia, and states erase memories and the memories of entire communities. However, the installative seems to be using erasure almost as a form of militating against some form of amnesia. I'm also thinking about erasure as edit. In cinema, it is the edit, or in space, it is the object that's missing, the print that's missing, but the act that is populating the possibility of what it could be.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking that would you say then, when we talk about power and the various counters and strategies of power, you talk about neologisms and you talk
That's
about
right,
inventing,
yeah.
and partial as also a place. So in that light, I'm just thinking, and then the shadow of Imelda Marcos is of course falls over it all. But I'm just thinking that could erasure be thought of as a strategy against amnesia?
Yeah, that's an exciting philosophical reflection. But yeah, I would agree with that, but only to the degree that it should not replicate the binary of erasure and amnesia. Yeah. So I think in the case of, if we follow through Albano's proposition, although there is erasure, it's not total erasure too. Parts of it are erased, some are just, maybe there's overlap. So I'm more interested in that kind of...
But it's also an imprint.
An imprint, yeah.
Yeah, it's also, just as it's
it,
erasure, but it's
overlay.
also an imprint, which is being left behind. So
Yes, so...
yeah.
Yeah.
An ephemeral imprint. So it's, I think it's...
And also, if we look at Albano's work in relation to Medallia's bubble machine, so I think that's another way to get out of this avant-garde obsession with rapture. Yeah, and try to look at this repetition or organic forming of the bubble. No? Yeah, so yeah, so
The bubble is like Imelda.
could be. And in fact, I was so happy to see the bubble machine in the post-war exhibition of Okwi in the foyer and the center of the. So it's a perfect foil to this because the exhibition also begins with the atomic bomb, right? As this foundational moment of post-war. But with Medallia's bubble, it changes the methodology altogether.
We have to finish, but if there's a question,
Are there any more questions, please?
then can I ask?
Please.
Patrick,
you use the term normative terminology of installation art. No, I just want to, and as against that, of course, your choice of the word installative, which is actually still remains, and that it should remain enigmatic. It's a difficult word to actually internalize. You've found a whole counterposition within that, and that's the counterposition which you're posing against the what you're calling the normative criteria or normative terminology. So I mean, I would rest with your term installative just as a question to be thought for ourselves.
Okay.
I don't think that it can be adopted
Yeah,
necessarily.
Yeah, sure.
The clumsy term may have to remain, and then it begins to be annotated, and as you said, neologisms be formed.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to know whether the normative aspect has to do with its art historical lineage.
It is, yeah.
You think so?
Yeah.
I mean, is that your position, or is it to do with the fact that its origins are located, you know, in mid 20th century in the United States, as it were? Is it to do with the kind of political marking that we've attributed to it, or is it to do with the art historical exegesis of the term, or not exegesis, the art historical elaboration of the term in the highest, most formalist theorizing that we've had, which is the October group and subsequent. Of course, Rosalind Krauss rejects it, the whole position later on. But I just want to know, what is the normative in this?
I think partly you're right that it's part that it comes out of the exegesis of art history, of Western art history, of English language art history. So that is, I think, something to be marked. Secondly, the installation as a term can also be annotated in practice. Like what Albano has done, or even Ileana Lee, and even the Chiang Mai social installation. So that's why I brought up the Chiang Mai social installation, because the installation is retained as a term, but the ties would insinuate this social. No? So it becomes Chiang Mai social installation. So I think the inclusion of the word social changes the term altogether. So there are many ways to mediate this normativity in discourse or practice. So one can retain the term in fact, one can change it, or one can change annotate it, or one can change the declension from noun to maybe adjective. Yeah, so I think there are many ways.
So one little footnote to that. You said English language art history. There's Spanish and Portuguese language art history also, which is equally stringent in many ways. Paulo Herkenhoff writing on. But would the Filipino artists have been interested in somebody like Helio Oiticica?
Yeah.
They have known?
Yeah, through Medallion. Through Medallion, because Medallion
They were there together
at Signals in London. Yeah. David, I think, created certain conditions for Brazilian artists to be introduced. Correct, with Guy Brett. Yeah.
So the implication of that is that there was some kind of whether actual dialogue or now post facto we can develop a dialogue on the basis of the fact. Sorry, the condition. I should have on the condition on certain shared conditions of the dictatorial.
Could be, but
state.
this was instantiated in migration, not in the Philippines.
Sorry, say that.
In migration, not in the
David
Philippines.
Medallion,
In a
yeah.
site of migration.
In the diaspora.
In the diaspora. So that's another layer, I suppose, of the installative redistribution of the diaspora with when like Rashida Rain and also the Vil Medallion work together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Helio Oiticica is not basically a diaspora. He's
That's
only
right.
partially.
Yeah.
So he would have been carrying the indigeneity in relation to the establishment or the state in circumstances within Brazil. So I just wondered.
But also Lygia Clark and others.
Lygia Clark.
Lygia Clark's practice as well. Yes.
Yeah,
I think we, this was a very enriching discussion. Thank you. And although, of course, we did not stick to our mandate and, we moved in many different directions, but then installation art as a genre is anyways not something which is defined by its objecthood, but it's defined by its field. So perhaps the discussion also should be distributive and redistributive. And with that, thank you so much for participating so intensely. Thank you.